I'm Mara Cates, 29, and I was standing at the back of my brother Reed Rowan's wedding in a converted Houston warehouse when my life split cleanly in two. Nearly 500 guests filled the room with glassware, candlelight, and that polished kind of laughter rich families mistake for warmth, while I stood at a side table they'd tucked near the service doors. When I lifted my napkin, a folded note slid into my lap, and all it said was, "Don't let them get you alone tonight. Go home and open the gray box in your kitchen. D.K." I had just read it twice when my father, Vincent Rowan, rose with his champagne and turned toward the crowd like the evening still belonged to him. He smiled at Reed first, then let his gaze pass over me as if I were part of the rented furniture, and announced, "I only have one child worth being proud of." The silence hit before the whispering did. And then my mother, Celeste, tipped her glass and added, "The one in the back was a mistake we kept too long." Nobody moved fast enough to stop the shame from spreading, and Reed didn't turn toward me, didn't interrupt, didn't do anything except stay standing in the glow they built for him. I kept the note in my fist, picked up my bag, and walked through the side aisle without giving them the collapse they were waiting to watch. By the time I reached the parking lot, I understood the note for what it was, not a warning about that toast, but permission for everything that came after. I drove home with Diane Kessler's note folded inside my fist, and when I reached my kitchen, I went straight to the upper cabinet above the stove. The gray file box sat exactly where she had always told me it would be, behind serving platters my mother only used when guests were worth performing for. Taped beneath the lid was Diane's handwriting again. One clean sentence in blue ink. "Your feelings were never the problem, but paper is what shuts people up." Inside were 3 bundles, each clipped and dated with the kind of order that turns suspicion into something no one can laugh away once it is opened. The first held overdue notices, refinancing disclosures, and private investment statements carrying my mother Celeste Rowan's signature across balances she could never charm into disappearing. The second held reservation confirmations, expense records, and reimbursement trails linking my father Vincent Rowan to dinners and hotel stays that were never part of foundation work. The third bundle was thinner, but it landed hardest because it held transcripts, call logs, and Diane's note telling me which recordings actually mattered. I opened my laptop, unlocked the folder I had hidden for years, and played the first file where my own voice asked one question too calmly. Vincent answered without hearing danger in me at all, and his voice came through the speakers low and easy. "Your mother only knows the version of me I perform." I played the second file and heard him again, irritated this time, dismissing me with the same contempt he had polished into that wedding toast. "Reed understands what matters," he had murmured. And then the part I had spent years trying not to make central, "Mara makes everything heavier than it needs to be." I looked down at Celeste's overdue notices, then back at the waveform on my screen, and every gap in the house I grew up in stopped looking accidental. The proof on my table did not change what they were, but it changed what I had to do with it before they buried me under their version. I read Diane's line once more, stacked their files by name, and understood why she had waited until tonight to put the box in my hands. Then I called Miles Avery, listened to the first ring cut through my kitchen, and when he picked up, all I gave him was this: "I need help doing this clean." Miles Avery arrived before midnight with 2 hard drives, studio headphones, and the kind of calm that made panic feel wasteful instead of urgent. He listened to Vincent Rowan's voice, checked the file timestamps, and looked at the metadata long enough to strip the night of any fantasy. When the last recording ended, he set the headphones down beside Celeste, Rowan's overdue notices, and gave me the only warning that mattered: "If you do this messy, they will turn you into the story." So we built it clean, starting with what could be proven, what could be witnessed, and what would collapse first once the room stopped belonging to them. The speaker stayed. The files were duplicated. and every document Diane Kessler had preserved was sorted into separate envelopes with names I already knew by muscle memory. My father first. My mother second. Reed Rowan last. Because his damage would not come from volume but from standing in the wreckage after the others failed. Miles moved through my kitchen checking backups while I drafted the text they would trust, precisely because it sounded smaller than the wound they had opened. I wrote that I did not want the wedding to define what happened between us, that we should have dinner privately, and that I wanted to settle things before they worsened. Then I added one deliberate line. Bring Jillian if you want. Because Reed's new wife was the only person in that family system whose eyes still meant consequence. Jillian Price mattered for one reason no one in my family would ever say aloud. Reed still cared how he appeared in front of her. If the truth landed with only us present, Vincent would call me unstable. Celeste would call me cruel. And Reed would let their version settle over everything by morning. But if Jillian sat at my table and watched each layer open in order, then the room would hold more than history. It would hold a witness. By 1 in the morning. The structure was finished and my anger had somewhere better to go than my mouth. Miles stood at the doorway with one copied drive in his jacket pocket and told me not to confuse silence with mercy once they started begging for it. After he left, I looked at the envelopes lined across my table and understood that, for the first time in my life, I was not waiting to survive them. By Thursday evening, my dining room looked calm enough to fool anyone who still believed good manners meant good character in a house like ours. Candles burned low. Water glasses lined the table, and the speaker sat near my plate, like something ordinary, waiting quietly for its turn. When Vincent Rowan, Celeste Rowan, Reed Rowan, and Jillian Price walked in, they carried the same expectation that I had invited them there to shrink again. For the first several minutes, we moved through dinner, as if the wedding had left behind only a stain polite people could ignore by morning. Jillian tried to soften the room with easy questions, and Reed answered in that smooth voice that had carried him through every room built to admire him. Vincent watched me over his glass. Celeste barely touched her food, and both of them kept waiting for tears they could classify and use later. Reed spoke first, setting down his fork and calling the wedding unfortunate before adding that we were all adults and should act like it now. I let that sit between us for one breath, then another, and told him he was right about one thing, which was why I wanted honesty tonight. Before anyone could ask what that meant, I reached for the speaker, pressed play, and let Vincent's own voice enter the room before his temper could. The recording opened with traffic. Then my voice. Then his, warm in a way none of us had ever heard at home before. Your mother only knows the version of me I perform drifted across the table, followed by words meant for another woman and never for his family. Jillian turned toward Vincent first. Not shocked yet, just listening carefully enough to make his face change before the file had even finished playing. Vincent lunged across the table and hit pause so hard the speaker skidded against the wood and struck my water glass beside it. He did not call the recording false, did not deny the woman, and did not explain the hotel invoices sitting sealed beside my elbow all night. Instead, he stared at me like exposure itself was the crime and demanded what kind of daughter records her own father in the first place. I slid the second envelope toward Celeste, but Reed grabbed it first and spilled overdue notices, refinance disclosures, and private investment losses across the tablecloth. His expression changed line by line, because numbers are harder to smother than people, and Celeste's name appeared on every page beneath the collapse. She called it temporary, called it manageable, called it none of my business, while the legal warnings beside her plate made each word sound thinner. That was when Reed tried to drag the room back toward me, asking whether ruining his wedding week was finally enough to satisfy me somehow. I did not hand him chaos, only a timeline of late messages, travel overlaps, and the simpler truth that mattered more than flirtation ever could. Everything in this family had always been arranged to keep him brightest, and even my humiliation at that wedding had been staged beneath his lights. Jillian looked from the papers to Reed and asked whether there was anything else at my table she could prove tonight for herself. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at me instead of her, which was the first honest answer he had given all evening. Vincent started cursing. Celeste began crying, and I looked at the speaker, the files, and the untouched plates before telling them no one would decide my silence again. The next morning, I woke to missed calls, unread messages, and a silence in my house that felt cleaner than what they had left behind. I did not return a single call, because the evidence had already said everything my voice never could inside that family anyway. By noon, the first thing to move was distance, and Jillian Price created it when she left Reed Rowan and went home. She posted one brief statement before sunset, careful enough to protect herself and sharp enough to close the door behind her completely. She wrote that she had discovered betrayal and cruelty inside the family she had just married into, and would not remain inside either. She never used my name, never explained dinner, and that restraint gave her words more force than anything louder might have carried. The wedding toast finished the rest, because someone had recorded Vincent Rowan raising his glass and calling me the mistaken back. Once that clip moved through donor circles, neighborhood texts, and the social world my parents treated like a private religion, their version cracked fast. People who had smiled through his speeches suddenly had proof that his cruelty was not family stress, but character placed in public view. Vincent fell first, exactly where he had always hidden best, inside a reputation built from polished language and borrowed moral authority there. Foundation board members started asking questions. Donors pulled away. And the woman from the recordings had a husband powerful enough to keep talking. By the end of the week, Vincent was on leave, then out. And for once, he looked smaller than the room itself. Celeste Rowan followed under a different kind of pressure. Because debt travels fast once documents begin matching the rumors people were already carrying. The overdue notices from my table became calls she could not charm away. Then, legal pressure, frozen access, and the loss of women who once needed her nearby. She had spent years arranging herself like a finished portrait, and now every crack in that frame belonged entirely to her alone. Reed did not lose everything in one spectacular collapse, which made his unraveling feel more real than any dramatic ending ever could. Jillian was gone. Clients looked harder at him, and every polished introduction now carried hesitation from people wondering what else was staged. I said nothing in public, sent nothing further, and learned that once you stop chasing the story, truth keeps walking alone anyway, untouched. On the 7th night after the wedding, my doorbell rang, and when I opened it, the 3 people who built my life around absence were standing there together. Vincent Rowan looked gray and diminished. Celeste Rowan stayed near the walkway as if shame had finally become heavier than perfume. And Reed Rowan could barely hold my eyes. No one had come to understand me. The evidence was already sitting in their faces. In Vincent's career, in Celeste's unraveling, in Reed's empty ring finger. Vincent started first, asking for this to stop in the tone men use when they mistake exhaustion for authority one last time. Celeste stepped in behind him and called what had happened enough, even though the legal notices, the lost donors, and the silence around her proved she had only just begun paying. Then Reed moved forward, dropped to his knees on my porch, and asked me to tell people it was not all true, as if truth had become negotiable because it finally hurt him. I looked at him there, at the same brother who had stayed still beneath the wedding lights while our parents used me to make him shine brighter. He was not kneeling because he finally understood what they had done to me, and he was not there because love had found its way back. He was there because losing me had cost him nothing, but losing himself had finally taught him the weight of consequence. That was the first moment in my life their grief did not pull me toward them, because it no longer sounded larger than my own. I told Vincent he had mistaken control for fatherhood, told Celeste she had mistaken image for dignity, and told Reed the version of this family built around his comfort was over. Then I gave them the only sentence that belonged to me from beginning to end. You spent years calling me the mistake. But I was never the mistake. I was the bill coming due. And once those words left me, the whole porch went still in a way that felt earned. I closed the door before any of them could reach for a softer ending, stood in my quiet house, and finally understood what peace sounded like. The next morning, I put Diane Kessler's folded note into my wallet, left for work on time, and carried nothing with me except a life they could no longer name for me. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and for holding space for the kind of quiet pain people usually survive alone. If some part of Mara stayed with you tonight, share the moment that hit deepest. I hope you leave here choosing peace, love, and your own name.